Believe it or not, this is your last thing that you are going to learn for this class. So we are just going to finish up on embryology right now and get through the end of this list. So picking up where we left off, so what I want to kind of see together or have you see the process of clearly here is kind of from start to finish. In terms of fetal development. So obviously we already went through this stuff where nothing really looks like a human being at all. You're just talking about cells at this point embedding themselves in the lining of the uterus. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the details here and forget that, where this is happening is in the endometrium. And then it gets really disorienting because this growth happens incredibly quickly. But here what you can see, and this is kind of confusing for a lot of people at first, when you look at the formation of the placenta being this very, very large structure that actually can essentially encompass the entire developing embryo. But that doesn't stay that way, and most people are more familiar with looking at this kind of fetal picture essentially with basically morphogenesis already taking place, meaning that you have all the pieces, you've got all the bones, all the ligaments that you'll ever have in your life, all your fingers, all your toes, very, very early on. And remember, morphogenesis, that term means to essentially to take shape, and then you've got to grow. And so the fetal stage is principally growth. That's really what you're looking at. And so when you go in for, an ultrasound or a sonogram, whatever you want to call it, you're really waiting to the point that morphogenesis is done. And so the two big things that you're looking at is size. You're looking at, initial growth trajectories. So how much, is the fetus growing at the normal pace, that sort of thing. But also, did morphogenesis happen the way that it's supposed to? And so you have to wait. You can't do that right away. You can't do that back when you're an embryo because morphogenesis isn't done yet. And so once you get to about that week 12 mark, you start to have full morphogenesis. Proportions are still very weird, but you have that taking place. And then you also get to see the placenta. You get to see the placenta and its actual location. And that's really important because the placenta is formed, the location of the placenta is mostly based on the implantation location. It's a nice rhyme. And so it's kind of random. And if that happens over, the connection from the uterus to the outside world, which is the cervix, then you've essentially blocked off the exit. And so those kind of placental abnormalities can be very dangerous. And so those are the other things you're looking for is where is positioning here? Because, it's not super common, but definitely does happen where you have the placenta in a place that makes a birth more high risk. And so you can check for those things at about this stage and moving forward. And so as growth progresses, I'll stay on this picture. As growth progresses, the placenta stays about the same size, but the fetus will grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And so the relative size of the placenta will shrink, but this placenta itself stays about the same size. And so what we're going to finish off with our terminology here is we're going to look at the details of the placenta, and then we're going to look mostly at these terms at the very bottom here. And the two terms that are up here that I didn't cover before in the video that I do want to cover is the Decidua Basalis and the Decidua Capsularis. And so decidua is like a deciduous tree, basically like the leaves that fall off and come back each year. The decidua term is referring to the functional layer of the endometrium. So you can think of the similarities as a cycle where something sort of dies, goes away, and then comes back in the same form, just like leaves. And so that's where that decidua Latin term comes from. So we're talking about the functional layer of the endometrium here, and we're dividing it into a basal layer and a capsular layer is essentially what these mean. And so when you look at a 13-week or on developing fetus, you can see this a lot more clearly because you'll notice that there's the amniotic sac here in blue, but then there's actually a layer of the endometrium on the outside of it. So all the way around, you have a capsule of endometrium surrounding the amniotic fluid. It's very, very thin, but it's called the Decidua Capsularis, and it thins more and more and more as the fetus grows. And so just like you had, if I go back a picture, just like you had here, a layer of the functional endometrium. Sorry. Because this is sort of more easy to visualize. It's implanted in the endometrium. So this is the Decidua capsularis around the outside. And then the portion of the endometrium that is not sort of on the outside of the developing, in this case, embryo, or in the next slide, fetus, that's the Decidua Basalis. So that is really where most of the blood flow is that it will eventually connect to the mother. And so in both of these pictures, you can see the Decidua capsularis and the Decidua Basalis. So basically, this is the transition point right here, here and here in this picture. And then here it would be basically the placenta. And so here's our Decidua Basalis. Even though there's just a box right here, the Decidua Basalis would be the area of the functional layer of the endometrium where the placenta actually attaches in this picture. And then the Decidua capsularis is where we started looking at this layer of endometrium that surrounds the amniotic sac. All right, let's go to this picture. So what we're looking at here is zooming into this little box here. So when you zoom into this little box, you can see the details of the placenta. And so on your list, it's broken down into fetal and maternal portions. Remember the fetal portion of the placenta, another name for that is the chorion. And so we've already talked about chorionic villi. So you can see the chorionic villi in detail here. They are clusters of capillaries that are bringing blood from the fetus via the umbilical cord, and it's bringing that blood into the placenta. Now notice the blood that is coming from the fetus is blue because it has not been oxygenated yet. I was going to say oxygenated yet. So it's darker in color in this image to represent that, and then as the blood enters the chorionic villi, which again are just capillary beds, that blood will be oxygenated because it is exposed to oxygenated maternal blood that's coming into these intervillous spaces in here. And so the oxygenated blood just gives off its oxygen to the fetal version of hemoglobin, which is extremely good at capturing oxygen. It's actually better than your hemoglobin. And that way the hemoglobin from the fetus always wins the tug of war between oxygen. So even if oxygen levels in the mother get very, very low enough to cause problems in the mother, the fetus will actually be able to still extract an adequate amount of oxygen. And so it will win that tug of war between oxygen, which is not so great for the mother, but good for the fetus. Then moving into the maternal portion here, you've got the Decidua Basalis, which is basically what we are looking at right here, just like we talked about just a second ago. The maternal arteries and veins, notice that these arteries and veins are normal in terms of their oxygenation, that common pattern, but not exclusive pattern. The arteries are coming in relatively high pressure. They are emptying blood into what's called an open circulatory system because these are not blood vessels. They are just sort of filling in here. That's the input of blood, which is high pressure. And then the draining of blood, which is low pressure, which goes into the veins and drains out back into the mother's circulation. And then our last section here is the umbilical cord. And so the umbilical cord is very consistently made of two arteries that are smaller in diameter and one large diameter vein. The reason that there are two arteries is that when you're carrying higher pressure blood, you don't have to make as thick of a wall of the vessel if the vessel is narrower. And so this is a common pattern that you see in blood vessels. Higher pressure vessels tend to actually have a smaller diameter than lower pressure vessels because it just makes it so that you don't have to make such a thin wall. So you've got a couple arteries here. And again, the arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood to the chorionic villi. And then the umbilical vein is draining oxygenated blood from the chorionic villi into the umbilical cord. And so the umbilical cord will then come into the fetus basically through temporary blood vessels that will close when you're born, but basically hooks up with the inferior vena cava right around the liver, and empties that blood into the developing fetus, where it then circulates and returns. And so that's basically the details that I want you to know about this picture. So running through it, really know those blood vessels, arteries versus veins. Don't be thrown off by the color change in the umbilical cord. And so know those details that you see in this list here and that you see on this picture. And as far as for test questions for this week, it's going to be entirely kind of PowerPoint pictures and that sort of thing. So all of these pictures that I've been going through, that's what I'll use for the quiz. So they'll be familiar pictures. So make sure you know these well for your quiz next week. As far as timelines and things like that, all I really care that you know is this general distinction between an embryo and a fetus. And so your general cutoff here is right around magic number 8. And so in those first 8 weeks, you are this embryo that essentially the reason we're using this different terminology is that morphogenesis is not complete as an embryo. And then you start using that term fetus generally when you have almost completed morphogenesis, which is usually around week 8. So otherwise, timelines, even if you see them in the PowerPoint, I don't care if you know them. Yeah, and that is it.